Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. I promised you still streams would be regular, but they've changed a little bit in at least their frequency. Obviously, we've moved beyond the Apple event. We got the iPhone 17 Pro Max. We got the AirPods Pro 3. Plenty of stuff to talk about, obviously, about my own impressions. You guys are free to ask questions about, obviously, how these devices have been performing for me. Hey, I even installed iOS 26.1 Developer Beta 1 just for the hell of it. But we are actually here not to talk as much about Apple as usual, but actually about Apple's main processing competition. So when it comes to other Android chips, we are primarily talking the Qualcomm Snapdragon series, and we are talking the MediaTek Dimensity series. Both of those companies now have new, flagship chips, I guess, because technically, like, there's even the X Elite above the 8 Elite, but that's more for laptops and maybe potentially for very high powered tablets, though we'll get to why some of that is a tiny bit weird. We also have smaller pieces of news in the world of Apple, and just something that I want to cover for my own mental health, I guess, which is just how much of an iOS copy HyperOS has increasingly become. It's not just that they copy the foundation, but they actually copy the details of the operating system, from the dynamic island to the general look of the Notes app to the iconography. So I think we have plenty to talk about. Expect like a 1.5 to 2 hour stream or something like that, maybe a little bit shorter. So I'm very glad to be back. As always, let me know how the audio and video quality is working for you. As always, support the YouTube jazz here on this channel. Subscribe, like, share, comment. You can leave a super chat to support me directly. You can become a channel member right here on YouTube. Shout out to Angelica, Steve, Max, Maximus, and Jonathan. Or you can become a supporter over on Patreon. Shout out to Ben Vinny, our MarkTech Pro Max supporter over there. So plenty of opportunities for you to engage. Of course, the Discord is also in the description of this channel. Very, very lively recently. A lot of people posting benchmarks from their own devices, posting benchmarks that they find online as these new chips are being announced. So that's a great way for you to interact with the community and to interact with me, of course, whenever I'm not live, because I will usually still find some time every couple of hours to at least look at the Discord, share my own 2 cents on a recent tech topic, while obviously the streams are far more time intensive. They require me being at home, they require me being in front of the laptop. So yeah, plenty of opportunities for you to engage. I'm really looking forward to just seeing more and more of you, getting your opinions, your agreements, your disagreements. I think that all tremendously furthers this channel, my own hobby with technology. So thank you very, very much for that. We already have the master yapper on this channel, Riley, in the live chat saying, bro, it's like OMG, such consumption. Well, we're gonna talk about the power consumption of the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5, which I also just need to like just get that off my chest. Like, what is this name? Like, especially like I thought, okay, man, they're gonna standardize everything to Gen 5, and afterwards we're gonna have Gen 6, Gen 7, Gen 8. But then the Snapdragon X Elite successor isn't suddenly Snapdragon X Elite Gen 5. It's not Gen 3 because technically it's using the third Orion CPU architecture. It's not the Snapdragon X Elite 2 because, as you can see here, the Gen comes after the word Elite. No, we got the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5. We got the Snapdragon 8 Gen 5. That's the lesser chip. That's not the Elite. That's more comparison to last year's Elite. And then we got the Snapdragon X2 Elite. In fact, we got the Snapdragon X2 Elite and the Snapdragon X2 Elite Extreme. So this is such stupidity. I think the branding here makes absolutely no sense. I think they're trying to just pile up numbers in the hope that in some ways their numbers look higher than Apple's. I'm not sure. The Snapdragon X2 Elite is kind of weird. We might get to some of its tech points, though I do mostly focus on smartphone tech when it comes to the competition. The laptop stuff to me is just generally less interesting, not because I don't care about other laptops, but I do care about other laptops that have distinct advantages over Macs. So the reason why I care about Intel technology, AMD technology, Nvidia technology is because they primarily offer gaming and pro app support that Mac OS might not have and that iOS and iPadOS definitely don't have. The reason why I'm just not as excited about ARM-based SoCs on Windows or an Android-based PC is because it breaks those two key advantages that I see those platforms having over Apple. And if you're telling me, oh, I just want a system that focuses on efficiency and everything, then get a Mac. Nothing is better than a Mac right now. So yeah, that's just my general recommendation. We also have Angelica joining the stream, saying she actually finished a little bit earlier at work to watch the stream. Well, thank you very much. Guess give you like a hi very early on. Thank you guys so much. The last few streams have done a lot better than the streams before that, so I hope that helps. I am back, as you can see, to my regular streaming time of like around 5 p.m. my time in Germany. You can let me know, of course, in the comments if that's good for you or I should try doing it an hour later. At best, 2 hours later. I definitely cannot do earlier because of obvious reasons. So yeah, feel free to let me know. But without further ado, let's get started. Now, the Dimensity 9500 did come out, but it is less interesting now to watch like the architecture deep dive or anything like that, because the main gist of the Dimensity 9500 is the CPU is kind of better, though it also mostly consumes more energy to achieve more power, but it has a pretty impressive GPU, especially when it comes to ray tracing. Now, I always caution to compare power consumption numbers from Geekerwan between iOS and Android, and that's because they have much deeper firmware level access to hardware information, and that's why I think that very often what they give us as GPU power or CPU power on iOS is actually the package power, which includes memory, and the faster memory is getting these days, it will be consuming more and more power, therefore throwing these benchmarks out of whack. So we are now at 9600 megatransfers, actually across all three chips. So that's one interesting detail. In prior years, Apple notably lagged behind in terms of memory speed. So for example, last year the A18 Pro used 7500 megatransfers per second memory, while the Dimensity 9400 pushed a lot of chips to 10,667 megatransfers per second, while some, like the OnePlus devices, use like 8533 still. That's mainly because the 8 Elite barely benefited from faster memory, but then the Dimensity 9500, well, sorry, I started talking about the Dimensity 9500. So the Dimensity 9400 was mainly 10667 megatransfers per second, so the fastest memory in terms of LPDDR5X specs that was available. A lot of 8 Elite chips also supported 10667, notably the Galaxy S25 Ultra, but a lot of them actually came with 8533 memory, and that still was just as fast, basically, like 98% or so of the maximum performance. So the question arose whether or not either the higher power consumption of 10,667 megatransfers per second memory negatively impacted like just the overall thermals and stability of the chip, or maybe if the memory controller, especially on the 8 Elite, just wasn't built to handle those speeds. And basically they just offered support for those speeds kind of as a bragging right? I mean, I'm not gonna say it's as theoretical because, but some Dimensity 9500 devices offer now like dual UFS 4.1 storage. So that's over 8 gigabytes per second of storage speed. That would be over twice as fast than what the iPhone Pros do this year, which just got two times faster. So that's like 4 or 5 times faster than previous generation iPhones. But that will also come with higher power consumption. If you look up, for example, how much more power a PCIe 5.0 drive uses versus a PCIe 4.0 drive, and that's using more modern technology usually, you will see why it just doesn't make sense in smartphones to go always the highest route. I mean, look at the Nintendo Switch 2. The Nintendo Switch 2 comes with 8533 megatransfers per second memory. But in no mode, not even docked mode when connected to a TV, when the screen is off, when it even is connected to the fan in the dock, it never uses 8533 megatransfers. In docked mode, it uses 6400. So that's the speed, for example, that Apple used on the A16 and A17 iPhones. And in portable mode, it actually uses 4200 megatransfers per second memory. So that's the speed that you had on A15 chips and older. I'm just trying to tell you that sometimes the bragging points of like, look, we get now to 12,000 points in multi-core Geekbench, but even our single core power consumption is like 22 watts. Like it's just at this point we are hitting the downsides. Unfortunately, in my opinion, did we hit a lot with basically dynamic power scaling on Intel chips in the past. The chips are built for very, very high peaks, and that makes sense when the peak is very short. It doesn't need to be sustained. It's just one app open, one web browsing download, something like that, right? But the more these numbers are being advertised to the consumer, the more it feels like they're becoming dishonest. Because Apple actually built not only a very efficient chip with the A19 Pro, but they also gave it more sustainable thermals than before, right? Which means there's CPU single core performance, there are gaming numbers. All of that is repeatable, all of that is reliable. With the Snapdragon 8 Elite, even though some devices will get amazing results from it, I'm not down talking it. Like, you will see, for example, how good the OnePlus 13 benefits from it. But it's just not quite the same as, like, it's the same difference between, like, oh, technically there might be chips that are faster than the M4 in things like multi-core performance and especially like GPU performance. But will it be the same experience as using an M4 MacBook Air? Most likely not. So in order to understand all of this, let's start with the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 architecture deep dive from Geekerwan. Then we'll see actual benchmarks from the chip. And then we'll see specifically how it performs on one specific device, which is the upcoming OnePlus 15.
哈哈哈，朋友们，今年3家旗舰手机芯片中的最后一位，高通终于把他们。
So I should also note that unfortunately the subtitles, while they are there, they are not as good right now. I think they just very quickly had to put them out. And that's why there are big portions of the video where the subtitles just don't show up. So whenever that happens, that's not a fault on my side. That's not the fault of my internet or anything. I'll just have to infer what they're saying from the actual information on the screen.
新一代的骁龙芯片给端上来了。那高通这一次真的是一上来就整了个狠活儿。先不说性能如何，光是它的这个名字，就给我们先来了一个下马威啊。这次芯片名字叫做骁龙8 Elite Gen 5，是不是满脸的黑人问号呢？啊，高通的意思呢是骁龙改单数名字之后的第5代旗舰平台。
Yeah, basically they apparently like the branding of Gen, but they also like the branding of Elite, so they just combined it.
反正不管名字是啥，我们最关心的肯定还是这个新平台的性能和能效嘛，对吧？那我现在人已经来到这届骁龙峰会的现场了。
So a lot of YouTubers were invited to this event. It was actually a 3-day event, which I strongly believe this event is set up this way just so YouTubers actually can take a 3-day vacation. As you can see, it's quite a nice place with Qualcomm. Because there is absolutely no reason for this to be a 3-day event. Like when you think about, for example, how much information Apple packages into WWDC, which is like a 4-day event roughly, right? 5 or so. And that's for developers from across the world. That's how for developers to interact with each other, which I guess that's kind of the one benefit that an event like this would get. But then you really have like conferences and tutorials and basically TED Talks about the latest technologies. And then, of course, it starts with the main 2-hour keynote that introduces the new operating system, sometimes new hardware too. And of course, all of that gives all these people there to also opportunity to film themselves. With a chip reveal or even 2 chip reveals, that's just not what you need 3 days for. I mean, when you think even Apple launched 2 chips at the latest iPhone event, right? Between the A19 and A19 Pro.
但是新机的能效啊，包括处理器的这个各种改进，我们都已经测过了啊。所以呢，这期视频就和大家来好好聊一聊这个第5代骁龙8 Elite 好了。再给大家用这个 QRD 的工程机简单测一个能效啊。那等过一会儿又会很快有这个零售真机的视频带给大家，那么一起来看一下吧。这一代的骁龙8 Elite Gen 5啊，是继承了前代的基础设计思路，同样2个自研超大核加6个自研能效核组成的8核 CPU。超大核第3代 Orion L 核心，能效核是第3代的 Orion M 核心。虽然官方并没有公布它的架构细节，但我们还是逆向看了一下它的这个设计和前代有什么区别啊。这次 CPU 主要的架构变化是来自它的超大核，在前代表现已经很不错的超大核基础上呢，
Wait, are there big changes? Like L1 data cache, there's no info here, but I would argue they're probably the same. It's interesting that some numbers have gone down, but that's probably more efficiency tuning than anything else. And yeah, you have 9 wide decode, so it's not quite 10 as on Apple side, but yeah, which is interesting because usually it feels like you would increase cache if you're going with a wider decode branch, but I mean, it's not bad by any means. But I guess that explains some of the numbers that we're going to see, which is that efficiency is not really that improved here.
进一步做了架构调整。首先，前端解码单元从上一代的8宽设计进一步加到9宽整数寄存器的深度也有所增大，也进一步的提升了峰值预测能力和进一步微调了调度器的这个队列深度。但是它的整数6个 ALU 还有浮点4个 FPU 的后端规格是和前代保持一样的。看得出来啊，高通这一次在超大核上的这个架构调整，主要也是在提高它后端执行单元的利用效率。这样的架构更新呢，算是稳扎稳打吧。我也比较期待这一次超大核这个实际表现怎么样啊？但是能效核的部分啊，这一颗8 Elite Gen 5。
So I guess the main culprit here of improvements are going to be the 9 wide decode, and to be quite honest, it's going to be the N3P node more than anything, which is going to allow it to be clocked higher. But then again, at that point, you are giving up basically all efficiency advantages that N3P brings. So in most real-world scenarios, you're probably not clocking this chip to 4.6 gigahertz. And if you're going to see some of the power consumption numbers later on, I'm now really doubtful about like the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 for Galaxy clocking at 4.7 gigahertz. While it's definitely possible, we see an incredible loss of efficiency from like that 4.6 gigahertz, to be honest, even beyond 4.2 gigahertz, but we'll get to those numbers. And then to hit like the 5 gigahertz that are being advertised for like the Snapdragon X2 Elite Extreme.
我就没有什么大的惊喜了，整体架构依然延续了前代的风格。这颗核心的定位是比
so the subtitles do have problems.
较接近 ARM 的 A7XX， 也就是现在的这个 C1 Pro 的。 4宽解码加上4个整数 LU，2个服务点。
Basically, the M core is much smaller. It's interesting they call it M core. So this is large. This is basically middle, medium. I assume they have an S core in the weighting, maybe for something like smart watches. And this is kind of interesting because it's weird because it's nowhere near as efficient as like Apple's E-cores, but it's more powerful. So potentially these M-cores can be utilized for more tasks than Apple E-cores, which of course would allow the chip to more often disengage the L-cores, which in turn could improve efficiency. Over Apple, that's very unlikely because obviously while Qualcomm does have a big influence on Android and the thread scheduler in there, it's nowhere near as comprehensive as Apple's control of iOS, even apps from the App Store, obviously their own first-party solutions on iPhones. And then, of course, in this case, then the kind of the complete outlier here is actually the Dimensity 9500, which it's Pro. It has its best cores are premium, so it's really the worst branding exercise. So its Pro cores kind of are more comparable to the M cores, but then it also has efficiency cores that are direct successors to the somewhere between the A500 and A700 series. And while those can be efficient because of just how small and kind of how powerless they are, they're also pretty useless for a lot of scenarios. So because then the chip, the Dimensity 9500 in this case, more often forces the engagement of its medium cores, and they are not as efficient as the M cores on the 8 Elite, now we'll see some explanations why over the course of the videos we're going to be watching why the 8 Elite Gen 5 is a more efficient processor, at least from its CPU perspective, than the Dimensity 9500, though both of them pale in comparison to Apple's A series chips.
FPU 的设计就是一个很典型的现代能效核的规模吧，考虑到拿工程机测能效也没什么说服力啊，这两种核。
Okay, 5G chipset. This one comes with the X85 modem. So the 8 Elite last year came with the X80 modem. That's the same modem powering this year's iPhones. And that's actually a big improvement on Apple's part because Apple used to be for one generation, there were 2 generations behind, which is when Qualcomm introduced the X80 on the 8 Elite, Apple simultaneously launched the iPhone 16 series with so-called X71 modems, which were kind of similar to X75 modems, but still too close to an X70. They were basically a custom design. And basically this year they're now much closer. The differences between X80 and X85 are now incredibly small. We are really hitting diminishing returns when it comes to 5G and Wi-Fi modems. Apple does not target necessarily always the highest speeds, except for stuff like millimeter wave. That's why, for example, they don't build on 320 megahertz Wi-Fi 7, which a lot of Android competition does. So that's why you would see a big difference in peak download speeds on the iPhone. But then again, ask yourself, does your home internet even support beyond 2.4 gigabits per second downloads, right? Because that's what 360 megahertz Wi-Fi 7 is used for. And unfortunately, if you do implement 320 megahertz Wi-Fi 7, you'll need now a more elaborate antenna for all of this. It definitely consumes more power. And while I'm sure Apple will eventually integrate it, I wouldn't be surprised if they create like an N1X modem for MacBooks or iPads or something like that, or maybe down the line N2X and 3X. But I would understand, for example, if they almost never gave like basically double bandwidth to base iPhones and certainly iPhone E's. And of course, cheaper products like a HomePod Mini or an Apple TV.
新的 spec 能效呢，我们就放到真机上再来给大家揭晓好了。我估计你们很快就能看到这个视频了。缓存部分815的 CPU 缓存。
I think the C1X gang has been quiet, Riley, because the C1X is actually pretty good, right? Like, I mean, we can argue about like how good it is, but everything that I hear from iPhone Air users is that their network connectivity is stable, and they're definitely getting way better than you would expect from a device with what 3149 milliampere hour battery in terms of 5G battery life. So Apple promised, for example, 30% more efficiency on the C1X versus the X71 modem, or to be more precise, they just talked about the modem on the iPhone 16 Pros. So yeah, honestly, I would love to see a more detailed analysis, and I'm pretty sure that guys like Geekerwan will do so. They did for the C1. It would be very surprising, but right now the problem for Chinese YouTubers, in order to test the iPhone Air, they actually cannot, because eSIM doesn't work in China. Well, I mean, technically, for the most part, it doesn't. And that's why the iPhone Air is currently not available in China.
依然延续了前代的整体设计，超大核促跟能效核促分别共享12兆的 L2 缓存，并没有。
Yeah, so system level cache is kind of the biggest difference between the 8 Elite or the Elite chips and Apple's chips. So they choose to give a lot of memory to the GPU. This generation, I believe it's gone up to 18 megabytes or something like that, while Apple chooses to prioritize system level cache. So that's cache that's going to be accessible to the GPU, to the neural engine, to the CPU, and that's in the case of the A19 Pro, that's 32 megabytes. So technically, like, they give like more cache to the GPU, which can be beneficial in terms of latency and timings and efficiency, even because it just puts it much closer to the GPU. But then you also have to consider that games are usually not GPU only tasks, so having cache that's actually accessible simultaneously by the CPU and the GPU, and a larger amount of it, will have benefits on the A series chip. So those are different approaches. Neither one is right or wrong. I will question some of their power consumption numbers, especially for Apple's GPUs. We did talk about it in prior Geekerwan videos, where I've pointed out how they focus on package power, because that's what they can measure on iOS, while they have much better firmware level access to understand the power consumption of separate components on Android. That's not a theory. That's not a conspiracy. They've talked about how even companies like Xiaomi, who launched a flagship processor early in the year, actually came forward to them and gave them that kind of firmware code. Apple does not do that.
CPU 专用的 L3 缓存，这个设计思路和苹果的 A 系列芯片如出一辙，再加上8兆的 SLC。
When it comes to CPU overall, the cache is pretty much the same. L2 cache is the same. System level cache is the same. Core layout: 2 main cores, 2 prime cores, 2 medium core, 6 medium cores. All stays pretty much the same.
就构成了 CPU 部分可以访问的所有缓存了。那我们这一次也是找到老朋友，开出了815的
They have a pretty die shot.
那这个就是815的一个芯片内部的结构了。
You can see they very quickly had to put out this video. The main gist here is that the chip is basically the same size, and while some stuff has been moved around, it's not really a game-changing difference. It's interesting that they call this the X80 5G modem, because I'm pretty sure that the 8 Elite Gen 5 platform advertises on the website to be using the X85 modem. We can actually test it. So I wouldn't be, because it's not like it's labeled on the die. These are labels that they put on it themselves. And this is something that's easy to get wrong. So I'm not going to be too angry. But for all those people who claim that Geekerwan is like, it's like the word of revelation from God when it comes to tech reviews, they're not. They still have quite a few issues. They're obviously trying to put out some content really, really fast, and that's where mistakes are being made. Tech specs 8 Elite Gen 5. A masterpiece of performance. Jesus Christ, like people talk about Apple using superlatives, right? But then somehow it's okay for Qualcomm to do this. Yeah, the Qualcomm 5G modem is the X85. So, yeah, just always reminder, everyone makes mistakes. People on official websites make mistakes. YouTubers make mistakes. Translation people make mistakes. So, always make sure to double and triple check the information you are consuming. The die is 2 mm bigger. Exactly. I said it's basically the same size. That's kind of margin of error. Yeah, and this is what I meant about the GPU cache. So we basically went from 12 megabytes of GPU cache to 18 megabytes of GPU cache.
差异放在一起啊，你明显就感觉这个差别好像并不是很大呀，封装尺寸都和前代保持了相
Okay,
同。
yeah. So they did mention it. 14 times 15 point what?
而 die size 呢，从前代的100。
Okay, 126 versus 124. I'm a little confused by what this means then. Why is there a difference here but not here? Even then, if you multiply those numbers, you aren't getting these numbers. So I'm not sure what that is.
24平方毫米只是略微增加到
Is that the
126
overall package size, including memory or something like that?
平方毫米，超
But
大
even
分的
then, the memory is on top of it, so now I'm really confused. The area of the super large core is slightly larger. That comes from the 9 wide decode.
面积比前代稍微大一点点啊，但依然是各家的超大核里面面积比较小的那个。而且从 die shot 上呢，你就能看出来它的整个后端执行单元的大小几乎是没有任何变化的，这也印证了我们前面逆向分析的结果。那 CPU 部分最大的改动就是新增了4组独立的 SME 单元。
So this is interesting because they went really above and beyond to integrate scalable matrix extensions improvements. Obviously, a lot of people complained last year that a lot of the performance benefit that the A18 Pro held in Geekbench over something like the Snapdragon 8 Elite, or even the X Elite, and the Dimensity 9400, that came from scalable matrix extensions, scalable matrix extensions 2. Those are part of the ARMv9 instruction set. They're optional, so you can still make an ARMv9, even an ARMv9.3 CPU without that. A lot of people also said technically it doesn't measure the actual CPU because it's technically separate from the main CPU cores because they're kind of separate accelerators. Obviously, that's different from something like the ISP or your AI accelerator. I'm not sure if that's the VPU here, which would be pretty small by a lot of standards these days. Some SoCs dedicate like 1/4 to 1/3 of the die space to like the AI accelerator this year. And then you have obviously media encoders and decoders. So there are plenty of accelerators. If we did everything just through the CPU, our systems would be a lot less efficient, a lot more hot, and basically modern smartphones would be very different. So it's absolutely fine for them to use scalable matrix accelerators, but having 4 of them is kind of funny, just saying.
这个也是今年新加入的特性了。当然，你们肯定也知道，这 SME 除了加速部分应用之外呢，也可以大幅提升 Geekbench 6
Yeah, I honestly would say this is kind of the main benefit. While yes, it significantly improves certain AI tasks that can run on the CPU, you can also run those AI tasks on the GPU and, of course, the AI engine. So I find it funny because why is it okay for Apple to do this, but potentially a little bit less okay for somebody like Qualcomm? Well, that's because Apple controls the backend. Apple can actually make sure that more tasks in the operating system are built directly to use SME. Apple can also make Core ML and MLX development platforms and APIs that allow AI tools, not just Apple Intelligence, but you can run third-party AI large language models. And Apple can make it so that these tools directly integrate with the full SoC. So while yes, the fastest part on Apple's SoCs for AI is still the neural engine, for example, this year they like tripled the AI compute output of the GPU by giving neural accelerators. Before that, they've given AI accelerators to the CPU. And that's why an AI task could potentially access all parts. And that would benefit, obviously, total bandwidth, total cache availability. Because while, yes, the largest cache, for example, on Apple's chips is the SLC cache, the system level cache, there will still be some cache that's exclusive, quote unquote, to the CPU, to the GPU, especially things like tile memory. So the faster you make these other components for AI, the more you benefit. But that's why iOS has a way, way better AI development platform than Android. It's just way, way more streamlined. While on Android, you have obviously the fragmentation between different hardware. So you have Qualcomm, you have the ARM off the shelf CPU and GPU portions. That's what goes into Dimensity chips, in the latest Xiaomi chips. Kind of into Samsung, though Samsung does some customization of their own. And then, of course, you have Google, which, for example, now use a Power VR architecture and a completely custom neural engine, or TPU in their case. And then they use mostly off-the-shelf CPU parts. And that's why it's so much more difficult to develop these kinds of AI tools for Android.
单核成绩啊，那能效核的主要改动也在于其独立的 SME 单元，并且能效核的后端设计上倒是有明显不同的。你可以看到核心内部是有一些区别的。优化好后端设计，对于能效肯定是有帮助的。这一点我们在测玄界的时候就已经给大家科普过了。那 GPU 方面，这一颗新的 Adreno 840 GPU， 你可以看到它还是3组 slice 的规格，而最大的变化来自 GPU 缓存，从前代的12兆增大了50%，来到了18兆的缓存，并且这个 GPU 和 NPU 之间这一代是有了硬件级同步，它可以直通了。对于需要异构协作的场景，就可以降低延迟和降低内存读写的开销。
So that's important because this is also how they're really pushing like super faster AI on something like the X2 Elite and things like that. Basically, they're connecting the AI engine. So I guess that's the AI engine, not the VPU. What would that stand for then? Is that like for media accelerators? Does V stand for video here? And basically the GPU and the AI engine can communicate very closely together. That way you don't need to go basically to memory and back, right? So much lower latency, much higher efficiency, and you share all the cache together. Obviously, you share the memory. That's the main benefit of an SoC. Will be interesting to see just how good it is. That's one thing I dislike about Geekbench AI. I would love to have a total SoC score. So they do allow you to test the GPU, the CPU, the AI engine separately, but I would love to have a chip that's just, oh, here is the API I plug in, and here is the native full SoC AI performance. I would love to see what an A19 Pro delivers versus like an M4 versus the 8 Elite Gen 5 versus the X2 Elite. So plenty of interesting stuff too, not just in terms of actual chips, but also how we test these chips and how we perceive those numbers.
毕竟直通之后就不用频繁去访问内存了。除此之外，这一代 GPU 在架构上，据我们所知，应该没有什么特别大的进化了。好，稍微聊了一下架构，那么应该大家最关心的还是实测的能效表现。在零售机的视频出来之前呢，我们就先拿工程机 QRD 给大家简单展示一下好了。首先 Geekbench 6工程机可以跑出单核。
So they are now the king when it comes to multi-core performance. Still a bit away when it comes to single core performance, but we are talking now about 5% differences. However, we're gonna see why these numbers here for the 9500, for the 8 Elite Gen 5, to me, very much sound like these companies went above and beyond. Now, I should also know that real world results will usually be like 5% lower. For example, the fastest that I got, my A19 Pro, is basically exactly 3900, which I mean is like 2.5%, close to 3% maybe. While with these chips, it will very much depend on the cooling and also the duration of a CPU benchmark. So for example, on Geekbench, it's a very short test usually, or it's one big test that's consistent of several smaller tests, and these tests usually end so quickly that the chip doesn't really have time to run super hot, basically run out of control in that time. And then this one, of course, here specifically because it's clocked at 4.6 gigahertz. Now, the Dimensity 9500 is clocked at 4.2 gigahertz, but seems to have similar struggles at that clock speed, where it loses a lot of the efficiency it otherwise would have if it were clocked to 3.8 or even like 4 gigahertz. And then, of course, A19 Pro is 4.2 gigahertz, but still performs pretty efficiently in that regard.
M846分，多核12546分。这个单核虽然还是打不过苹果的 A19系列啊，但是它打赢发哥的9500是没有什么问题的。相比前代81的提升也不小了。而多核则是问鼎了今年手机最强 CPU。那么多核能效上又怎么样呢？至少在这个工程机上还是挺猛的。
So this is where I would like to once again isolate A19 Pro. You would see that based on this graph, efficiency-wise, the A Elite Gen 5 seems like it would outperform, that it would actually be more efficient than the A19 Pro, because it would offer at the same power consumption actually more performance. This is gobbledygook. This has nothing to do with the real world. I mean, like again, the A19 is less efficient in multi-core tasks than the A19 Pro. You also see, by the way, interestingly here, so this is the reference device. This one actually uses the fastest available memory, which is 10,667 mega transfers. But then you see the 8 Elite. I don't even know which device was called 10 Pro Plus. I'm so over the stupid branding of most Chinese devices. But then the 9500 uses LPDDR5X 9600, as does the A19 Pro, and the A19 uses LPDDR5X 8533. So we just don't have the data for the efficiency stats. I mean, you can see how the A19 Pro, because they don't have firmware control here, right? They cannot just tell the A19 Pro, run at lower clock speeds or run at lower power, and we're going to test your performance. So we cannot know if like its efficiency curve looks somewhere like this or somewhere like this, putting it high above the 8 Elite Gen 5. That's why a plus, again, difference between actual SoC, or in this case CPU performance, versus more package power, which is CPU plus something like memory. So when it comes to Android, these comparisons are valid. Versus iOS, they're less so. And then again, also there are big differences between Geekbench here and then other tests. But I find it funny how people are now using Geekbench, even though when you will look, for example, at the X2 Elite, it still doesn't reach like the single core performance of the M4 Pro and M4 Max. So seemingly the Apple bench, Geekbench, is now the actually friendliest benchmark for something like the D9500, the 8 Elite, the 8 Elite Gen 5. So very clearly these companies have started optimizing their chips for Geekbench, I would argue in a way, over real world tests. It says 1067 on MediaTek side. Geekerwan. No. So that's different between what MediaTek is saying is correct. A chip, the Geekerwan, the Dimensity 9500, as did the 9400 before it, as did the 8 Elite. They do all support 10667 megatransfers per second memory, but whether or not it's being utilized in devices is depends obviously on the manufacturer of the product. So I mean, we can actually look that up. Did they mention what exact memory speed do they use? Because I remember it just saying no. LPDDR5X up to 5300 megahertz. So always this speed is half. Don't ask me why. I know the explanation very vaguely, but I always am afraid to say it out loud. But basically you have to double that, and then it becomes 10,600, 10,700 megahertz, or mega transfers per second to be more precise. Megahertz is not really the correct term here, but yeah. So no, the 8 Elite, the 8 Elite Gen 5, the Dimensity 9400, the Dimensity 9500, all of them technically support 10,700 mega transfers memory. But whether or not it's worth implementing it because it consumes more power than 9600 memory or 8533 memory, that is then up to the manufacturer.
那相比8亿明显迭代的同时啊，也是轻松可以干翻天玑9500，和苹果 A19 Pro 是不分伯仲吧。高功耗段还比它强一点点啊，不过这个峰值功耗也是完全拉爆了，就冲着20瓦去了呀。这显然不是一个正常手。
I also wonder how exactly they isolate that, because we've discussed that already in previous videos. Where do they take like the highest peak power consumption and decide that that's applicable to multi-core, which obviously it is for the multi-core, but how long is that peak, right? How much of its run does the A19 Pro actually spend at, what is it, at 12 watts, right? How much of its run does the 8 Elite Gen 5 actually spend at 18, 19 watts? So this is something that AnandTech used to do best. They very clearly had actually deeper insights into benchmarks like Spec 2017. Unfortunately, Spec 2017 is also reaching the point of no return, where it's kind of becoming a little bit useless in certain scenarios because it does not accelerate more modern parts of the instruction set. But then again, you can also see how in a test like Geekbench, you might potentially cheat a little by putting in like 4 SME accelerators.
能够跑到的功耗了啊！光看前面的常规能效段，8亿5的。
And even then, I would argue that between these two, there's like no it's still not regular power consumption. Like you don't want your smartphone to consume 10 watts.
工程机还是挺不错的啊，就是不知道零售机会是个什么水平啊。啊，以及还是提醒大家，这一代 CPU 在 GB6 里的提升呢，有很大一部分是归功于 SME2 指令集的加入的。实际性能到底强多少，就拿到后面的零售机跑了这个 Spec 2017者。
So that's what they promised. They also run GPU numbers. Now, I would actually like to go into the actual big video of theirs, and then in the end, we would get to the OnePlus 15 analysis, which is pretty short and brief right now. So, but yeah, basically, according to them, the D9500 is the highest performing, but then also when you look at its max power consumption of close to 15 watts, that again, most games run it anywhere from 3 watts. That's for lightweight games, even for some that run it like 120 FPS. All the way up to like maybe 7-8 watts. And even then it becomes a little bit questionable how sustainable that performance usually is. So most of the time you would find yourself pretty much in the middle of that, 5 to 6 watts, Android devices ranging on the higher side of that, maybe closer to 7, and iOS devices ranging on the lower side of that, because Apple prioritizes battery life, less heat generation, a cooler device. And you can see that we actually have the smallest gap, and unfortunately they did not include the A18, but we barely have 5% difference between the 8 Elite Gen 5 versus the A19 Pro. And that's interesting because, for example, the Snapdragon 8 Elite was actually like 20% faster in still no mid light versus the A18 Pro. And that's why I've always said it, and I know some people shit on me for that, but these 3D Mark tests, they're not very good mobile benchmarks. They are very memory bandwidth hungry, so they really like to scale with memory bandwidth. Sure, if an architecture is way better or way more accepting of higher power consumption, as we see with the D9500, they will go higher, but usually you can see like, oh, 10,667, oh, 9,600. It's not ideal, obviously. The amount of cores matters, the amount of cache per core matters, because cache is also effectively bandwidth. And we can see that it's definitely more efficient than the 8 Elite and that in GPU, and that's actually going to be proven out by real world tests and games. So that's something that I always try to say about the CPU, for example. The CPU numbers are very rarely, at least to me, proven out by real world results on the Snapdragon side. While in gaming, it's not that these numbers are interesting, but numbers somewhere around here. And yeah, then you can usually see not necessarily superiority of the 8 Elites or the D9000 series, but you can see that they're pretty close together. Sometimes one is better, sometimes the other. It will depend on the specific game, on the game engine, whether a game is more memory limited, or it maybe likes more on-die cache. So those are details, and those are very much why real-world results exist, and why we shouldn't ever focus on one individual benchmarks. And this is why, for example, I tell people that the Geekbench GPU benchmark, it's an overall compute benchmark. Some people say, oh, it's worthless for games, and there isn't some morsel of truth in there. But then I could also argue, well, look at, for example, how differently Solar Bay Extreme and Solar Bay perform. So which one is actually more applicable to ray tracing tests? And that's why one benchmark is never enough. Artificial benchmarks in general are never enough, and that's why I do want to see as many tests as possible by as many YouTubers as possible. Here you can see some tests by some games here. I believe this one is actually running at 120 FPS, and you can see how all these chips perform incredibly close together, both in actual performance, but then also in power consumption. You can see, though, that it's not perfect. The 8 Elite Gen 5 has lower 1% lows here than the 8 Elite, while consuming more power. So there is still obviously some early days driver challenges going on. Here is Withering Waves. You can actually see that despite what their graph showed here before, right, which is a more efficient D9500, you can see that here the 8 Elite actually performs a little bit better with notably higher 1% lows, while power consumption is roughly in the same ballpark. But to a very nice, not surprise, but just a very nice revelation is that power consumption is down from previous generations. And performance has gone up across the board in both overall frame rate, average frame rate, and 1% lows, except for the D9400 Plus somehow delivering the highest numbers. But don't forget, these results also have slightly different resolutions, and sometimes you might even have processor-specific game graphics settings, so it's not always exact one-to-one science like you can do on PC, where code is much more configurable, much more customizable than it is on mobile. That being said, that's about it for the entry video here. Then I would like to see the actual review of the Gen 5, and then we'll have a look at the OnePlus review.
联发科天玑9500
and I need subtitles.
之后，9月的压轴大戏来了。咱们今天就来好好看看这颗高通的新旗舰骁龙8 Elite 正5。这期视频里面你会看到815在量产机上的 CPU 和 GPU 的能效表现。那我们废话不多说，直接开始。Q2D 的视频里，我们已经详细介绍了815的架构，和815一样，依然有2颗超大核和6颗中核构成的利用效率，定位阶架构比较更窄。整体的核心改进的产物啊， 它主要以改善屏镜为主，小核则仅仅是轻微优化。那么它的 IPC 性能和能效会强多少呢？我们现在就来搬出 Spec 2017。
Before we get fully into that, you can see they call it a regular upgrade. So with the Dimensity 9500, they actually called it a pretty disappointing CPU upgrade, but then a great GPU upgrade. We're gonna see what they claim here. Also, the Geekbench numbers obviously seem to not quite reflect the Spec 2017 numbers. So I find it funny how people, again, this accusation of Apple Bench, and I've seen people meme online that like, oh, Geekbench will soon release Geekbench 7 to benefit Apple. And then, yeah, they don't. Very clearly, they already could have done some things to benefit the A series. In fact, if they focused more on integer performance, or hell, even FP performance just without SME acceleration, in fact, that would put the A series chip ahead. And yes, you can see that not only is it actually more powerful, landing significantly higher here, but also much more efficient. Yeah, so I guess that's it for the P-Core story at the very least. You can see even here where the gaps are still smaller, you can see a similar story. Here with the D9500, we see a lot of the individual core types. So the C1 Ultra, that's the main prime core. That's what the L core is on the 8 Elite. The 8 Elite Gen 5 and the 8 Elite. And then here we have the C1 Premium, which sits kind of like between an M core and an L core. It's really hard to describe. And basically their main takeaway about the C1 Premium on the D9500 is that it's basically a less efficient version of the C1 Ultra, because it's not really designed for higher efficiency, at least not power efficiency. It's designed for better die size efficiency. So that's why you can have one C1 Ultra, but then 3 C1 Premium cores, and then their actual E-cores here are C1 Pros. Then branding is absolutely crazy. Calling an E-core Pro, like I know some people complain that like, why does Apple's Ultra chip sit above the Max? But both at least are very high names, right? Like between Pro and Premium and Ultra in the same chip, that's just insane. And also, I think that, for example, like this chart shows pretty well that Apple's efficiency advantages come in comparison to some popular beliefs, they come from things way beyond the node, because every single current gen chip here is using N3P. It's last generation that uses N3E.
来直观的看看这次两种 CPU 核的升级幅度。先来看
，And that's the Xiaomi chip.
超大核能效，整数部分这颗8亿5的超大核看起来跟前几天的这个 C1 Ultra 有点像啊。那和前代的8亿超大核相比啊，在3瓦以上的功耗段，能效表现有一定的提升。但是3瓦以内，它的能效其实都没有超过前代的8亿啊，甚至有小幅倒退。
And again, this is also where we just don't know, because obviously they cannot configure the clock speeds of these cores. We don't know, does the efficiency core like run like this? Or like this, or like this almost, right? So it's doubtful that it would run like this. It's more like this probably. But just saying that this is why I'm saying try to compare the Android chips. But especially when it comes to like individual core analysis, this is where this just falls to the wayside, because they just don't have the same insight into Apple's A series processors as they do have with Android chips.
拿它和 C1 Ultra 相比呢，可以看到它俩在整数测试当中几乎是肩并肩的水平，只能说是难分高下。那么整数部分呢，它们都比较接近苹果的 A17 Pro 啊，距离 A19
So that's the chip in my old 15 Pro Max that's filming right now. And then obviously this one, the A19 Pro, that's one
比8亿的超大核强了不少，略微领先浮点同样很强的 C1 Ultra。好消息啊，是它的浮点能效已经。
Big FTC announcement from the United States. Amazon will pay $2.5 billion over claims that it tricked people into signing up for Prime membership in one of the FTC's largest settlements. Interesting. We have Rosa joining the chat. Hi.
已经追上 A18 Pro 了。那能有这样的浮点性能啊，不仅有核心本身的功劳，还要感谢内存控制器的改进。浮点测试对于内存性能要求很高。
Yeah, so that's important.
性能
Again, big questions last generation if the memory controller even truly benefited from 10667 megatransfers memory. This year, it definitely at least truly benefits from 9600 over something like 8533 or 7500.
以下骁龙8亿5和前代8亿的大核，那你会发现这一代大核在 IPC 上的提升是比较显著的。整数部分 IPC 提升了8%，浮点部分提升了11%啊。那综合的 IPC 提升已经接近10%了。那如果我们横向对比各家大核的水平，它的 IPC 还是会比 C1 Ultra 整体低一点啊。但是 C1 Ultra 毕竟是一个规格明显更大的核心，我认为8亿5的大核在内核效率优化上所做的工作是非常具有成效的。
And also, that to me barely matters. Like this focus on actual clock speeds. Like if the architectures are sufficiently different, like. I mean, 4.2 gigahertz here is different from like 4 gigahertz here. So yeah, I know some people like to focus on IPC. I've seen some stupid claims that supposedly the A19 Gen 5 has faster IPC than the A19 Pro. Brother, this is a chip that's like, where do you see that? And this is actually the higher clock chip. This is the 4.6 gigahertz chip. This is the 4.2 gigahertz chip. Like actual clock speeds, while yes, it is of course true that if you clock your chip higher, you will lose some efficiency in the process. So it's very impressive when a chip that's very high clocked is also very efficient. But don't forget, again, it's not comparable between very different architectures.
核心，我认为8亿5的大核在内核效率优化上系列处理器的水准了。那前面你
this is they improved here memory utilization basically. You can see basically the latency is much higher here on the in nanoseconds. So they definitely. We can argue if they can utilize the full speed of 9600 megatransfers per second memory, but you can definitely see that the A19 Pro, the 8 Elite Gen 5, you can see here they have slightly different optimal portions on the latency curve, while just the previous generation just like has up to double the latency. So very clearly its memory controller wasn't quite up to par. I would love to see the A18 Pro here. I know they have those numbers, but I would love to see it with last generation. What Apple's latency is when using significantly slower memory at 7500 megatransfers.
50%以上啊，可以说在内存性能上，8亿5的进化幅度是非常大的，这已经赶上苹果 A 系列处理器的水准了。那前面你肯定注意到，浮点能是非常大的，
like this also really depends where you analyze the curve, right? If you look at this portion of the curve, right, with this amount of kilobyte testing, right, that's half the latency. So again, like I'm not trying to say that the statement is technically wrong, because yes, at the highest end, the latency kind of comes together, and you can even see that at this portion of the testing, the A19 Pro can be like maybe even 10% slower when it comes to latency. But like, right, so this is why I always encourage people to look at the full graph actually and ask yourself why sometimes you do get the full graph, like here, and in other cases you don't get the full graph, like what you get with the overall CPU frequency and efficiency curve.
赶上苹果 A 系列处理器的水准了。那前面你肯定注意到啊，浮点能效曲线里面的8亿5 P 核的峰值功耗明显低于 C1 Ultra 啊。那看来这4.6 G 赫的8亿5大核肯定比天玑9500里4.2 G 赫的 C1 Ultra 更节能，对不对？哎，这个是挺可。
So this is very interesting, and I'm very glad they're covering it the way they are, which is very much a big focus on actually deep analysis, not just looking at one graph. Efficiency is way more than one wattage rating for one frequency, and you will see why.
没那么简单啊！我给你们随便看几个子项的成绩和功耗，你发现什么没有啊？这4.61G 赫下的性能。
Yeah, so you can actually see like lower performance at 4.6 gigahertz than at 4.26.
怎么没比4.26G 赫下强呢？来看看测试时的功耗曲线就知道了。你看这最高频点下，这降频都降成啥了？这单核峰值功耗直冲20瓦的水平，真的是手机能压制。
So this is very interesting because this is at 4.6 gigahertz, right? The power number that Qualcomm mentioned for the 5 gigahertz X2 Elite Extreme for a single core, so that's 10% higher clocked or 8% higher clocked, however you want to see it, right? Than this one. And they mentioned that it's at 18 watts. Now we see 22 watts as peak for the 4.6 gigahertz. And this is also why I mentioned why their inability to get really detailed analysis on Apple A series chips. I'm not sure if they could measure something like that. I would love to see it if they can. But you can see that you can technically achieve those 4.6 gigahertz at anywhere from 10 watts to 22 watts. The difference behind it is voltage. And voltage defines how well you can utilize your chip, right? So while yes, it might sound cool that you can get the full 4.6 gigahertz at 10 watts, you definitely see the stability issues that actually caused it to drop to 10 watts. So what is better for your chip in this case? Is it better to maybe start at 16 watts, but then actually like sustain it and drop it slowly over time in terms of voltage while still actually maintaining what would be at that point like 4.2 gigahertz or something like that? Or is it better to just start at crazy 22 watts, benefit a benchmark like Geekbench, right, which has short individual bursts, but then in reality, your chip just never actually runs at that. And while yes, it might still run at the clock speed, your chip performance will just not be the same when it's eating 22 watts or when it's eating 10 watts to achieve the same clock speed.
实际上，我们常规的控文手段早就没办法压住这个频点的性能了。为了找到4.61G 赫下的性能，我专门用液氮给它降温降到了零下80。
Oh wow! Okay, so he didn't just stabilize like its heat. He actually like cooled it down to, that's something I missed. He cooled it down to -80. So that's the only reason why it was able to get that crazy spike.
度啊，但最终很遗憾，还是跑不出正常的结果。那我是不知道什么样的温度才能让它跑满4.61G。
Okay, so this chip is just it's basically a Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5K, right? It's an overclocked chip that needs more cooling, needs more elaborate cooling, and even then, it will probably depend on silicon lottery and just on your ability to accept some instability. Like, for example, the 4900K, the 3900K actually had instability at those high clock speeds that actually damaged those chips in the long run. Yeah, that's not great. Or to be more precise, not at those high clock speeds, but at the high voltages needed to sustain the power consumption to sustain the high clock speed.
但这种持续时间又比较长，然后功耗又比较高的项目，那因为刚开始超高的功耗导致的积热问题会引发后面严重的降频。那实际的运行频率啊，甚至会比掉到稳定的4.26G 赫。
See? The stability of actually running it higher in terms of power consumption, but much more stable because it's a frequency that the voltage can actually sustain, and that the wattage delivery in that case is actually maybe not reasonable for a sustained load on a smartphone, but maybe just in theory you could also use that chip on a big laptop or a phone with active cooling, or maybe even a low power laptop. That's all an opportunity. Gamer Live 4568 saying, one more day before I get the iPhone 17. Well, now it feels like I'm showing off because I already have my 17 Pro Max. But hey, I'm really glad for you, man.
还要低啊，那它为什么会积热呢？ 你们还记得580 x3D 吗？那颗 CPU 上仅仅是核心上面叠了一层 L3 缓存，就已经有了严重的肌肉问题。而手机 SoC，
and that chip actually didn't consume that much power relative to the size of the die.
什么概念啊？它是把
but now that the transistors are getting more dense, we're now at N3P. I believe what kind of gate pitch are we now? 24 nanometer or something like that in reality. I believe 2 nanometers, then going down to a gate pitch of 20 nanometer or something like that. So yeah, the heat is becoming more and more difficult to escape. Not only are the cores relatively small, so this is also why I've seen some people say like, oh, but Apple has super large P cores. Of course they're gonna be still faster in single core. Yeah, but a large P core also has other advantages. Not only is it potentially more powerful, but it also distributes its heat a little bit better. Especially now that the transistors are getting more and more dense, which results in more and more heat trapping between individual transistors. It's now becoming more and more necessary to have more and more elaborate cooling. And this is why Apple introduced vapor chamber and an aluminum design for the A19 Pro. At least on the Pro models. On the Air, it's definitely not quite the same.
压在核心之上。
What should I check, gamer?
本身一颗核心的大小就非常小，热密度本身就极高，那这样一来呢，积热问题只会比 x3D 处理器还要严重无数倍。但最耐人寻味的是呢，这样的降频速度其实它并不会影响 Geekbench 6的成绩，因为 Geekbench 6的每一项测试时长都非常短，很快就跑掉了。所以在 Geekbench 6里，反而你可以跑出它的峰值性能啊。实际上，如果我们横向对比它和 C1 Ultra 峰值频点下的功耗，那不管是天玑9500还是815，标称的这个最高频点功耗都可以轻松给你干出单核远超10瓦的水平。本代的旗舰处理器都普遍存在着这样的问题。那实际上大家也都明白啊，在任何应用里你都几乎不可能用到这个频点。我真的不明白啊，这个 Geekbench 6的跑分就这么重要吗？值得专门
So he is now, you can hear it from his voice, he's scolding them. He very clearly understands what some people understood about two things on PC. One is Cinebench, and the other was CSGO. These days it's a little bit more CS2, but CS2 is far more GPU limited than CSGO was back in the day. It just looks way better than CSGO did. And a lot of PC CPU makers, well, mainly the two, AMD and Intel, they started optimizing their CPU specifically for these two tests because they knew that Cinebench was like the go-to artificial CPU benchmark, and they knew that CSGO was the go-to game to test CPU limitations, while obviously you would need a much more demanding title like Cyberpunk to test GPU limitations. And we are kind of hitting the point where Geekbench has become so ubiquitous and so popular that very much it seems that Qualcomm and even Mediatek are optimizing their chips to hit highest numbers in Geekbench. Does your day say September 26th? No, of course not. My day is September 25th and still will be for the next 5 hours and 48 minutes.
做一个评点吗？啊，别忘了啊，桌面端2年前1490K 的教训就摆在眼前。我是真不想在手机上看到1490K 了。
4900K, 3900K, they all suffer from this.
综合表现怎么样？
That's
那么在能
the
效曲线里，
7 nanometer node that really wasn't built to handle 6 GHz clock
8 亿
speed.
有所提升。那它的能效也比天玑9500的 C1 Pro 要强一些，并且这次的中核虽然小幅提升了0.1 GHz 的频率，但峰值功耗并未随之而增加。总的来说这个中核算是一次比较常规的升级。虽然说这个
That's about the improvement that you would kind of expect from just like the jump from N3E to N3P, maybe a little bit better than that.
幅度并不大吧，但好歹呢是比隔壁的发哥和阿尔玛诚意要足一点。那么我们看完了 Spec 2017的单核表现，感觉这次815的 CPU 部分显然更注重峰值性能的提升 ，CPU 激进的频点设置几乎就是为 Geekbench 6而生的。那我们就必须得赶紧来看看 Geekbench 6里面量产机上的815水平怎么样了。那么在强制散热下呢，815跑出了单核3836分，多核12352分的峰值成绩。这个成绩呢？
It's incredibly close to the reference device. This is why I also do like to see reference models and see how much they differ from regular devices. It's interesting because some of them are closer than others. So Xiaomi, notably, for example, definitely undervolts their chips. So even though they reach the highest clock speeds, they do underperform in raw performance, but then they tend to be a little bit more efficient. Now, how Samsung is gonna mention putting this at 4.7 gigahertz, hopefully getting very close to 4,000 just for brownie points, I have no idea. What will the impact of higher single core clock speeds be in multi-core results? Probably close to nothing. I would assume that the multi-core algorithm will probably be basically the same. I don't think they will be 100 megahertz faster. Obviously, the P-cores don't run at 4.7 gigahertz in the multi-core results, but maybe it would have still room for from 3.5-ish gigahertz to 3.6 or something like that for the multi-core results.
毫无疑问，已经问鼎了今年的手机旗舰 SoC 之王啊！而单核
And you can even see, by the way, basically this is about the difference of 2 E-cores, right? If you feel like it, at least in a multi-core test. So yeah, and then you have to ask yourself, do you actually have tests that want 8 threads on your mobile device? Which tests benefit more from having more efficient E-cores rather than having more of them? And this is why I think this is actually by far the most balanced chip. And I believe the gap overall is still very comparable to what it was last year. So here they have about 1,000 points, so a little bit less than that. So it's like a 10% difference here. And it's about a 10% difference here too. So nothing crazy. It's not like the entire balance of power has shifted. Obviously, the difference in single core has shifted. So here we find a 20% uplift to the A18 Pro. And actually now the current generation overtakes Apple's last generation, which usually doesn't happen. They much more often match or slightly exceed a 2-generational part. But again, SME2, we're gonna see what else comes next, either in the Geekbench CPU testing rig, whether there are different new tests in there, or whether they change maybe the duration of individual tests and how that would influence chips that are very clearly overclocked by default versus those that are more sensibly clocked. We'll have to see. You already see the differences between the results of something like Spec and the result of something like Geekbench. I would argue I'm very much waiting for a good Cinebench port to mobile. They do already have the tools, since they do have Cinebench running on Windows on ARM, so I believe it supports Vulkan on there. I mean, it might be DirectX 12 based, but they definitely support Metal, obviously, for Cinebench on macOS. So it shouldn't really be that big of a struggle to just port the benchmark portion to even maybe just the CPU benchmark portion. Nobody likes the GPU benchmark part of Cinebench to iOS. You know what? When it turns 11:59, it will say September 26th, my day. Well, congratulations if that's when you're receiving your iPhone, gamer life.
SME2 的增强也做到了仅次于 A19。
Which one are you getting? The base 17, the best value iPhone in years, one of the best value smartphones on the market right now.
系列的水平，但我们的观众都知道啊，峰值跑分呢也就图一乐啊，真刀真枪还得是拼能效。所以现在我们就搬出我们的
Thank you subtitles.
G6 多核能效曲线，来看看这颗815到底在哪个位置吧。结果很明确啊，815的这个多核能效也是相当不错的，轻松碾压了天玑9500。当天玑9500和初代8E还打得难舍难分的时候，那815啊已经在
Yeah, so this is Riley. You might have been wrong when you claimed they were wrong in the memory numbers that they're using. So this is I'm not sure if they're 100% correct. Because I obviously don't yet know the specs of the OnePlus 15. That's what they have early access for. But for example, their reference device was using 1067. So I assume this is the actual production ready OnePlus 13, which is coming out probably by the end of next month.
G6里面打出了代差。
And yeah, you can see that its inefficiency, at least according to this chart, right? It gets close to A19 Pro and A19. You can argue whether or not this is just a Geekbench thing, or more likely, again, this is their inability to disconnect the power testing here from the package power. You can also see that definitely, at least here, the A19 Pro definitely delivers higher efficiency in the 2 to 4 watt range. So yeah, Apple, if you feel like it, give these guys firmware to actually test it. Hey, give us that, and then make it into an API that's easily integrated into something like Geekbench. I think that would actually create quite a big amount of attention to the overall power, the overall scaling abilities, the overall efficiency of your chips.
中高频段它的曲线已经插进了 A19 Pro 和 A19 之间，效进步并不是特别，确实是有点吓人。
Okay, so they basically talked about what I talked about the different efficiency ranges from the top and the bottom.
频点很多
Can you please restore your Jesus, man, this is what I hate about fucking YouTubers sometimes. Look, I put out live streams. I fully understand I don't have the same workload anywhere near what they do. But you do have a dedicated English speaking audience. And like, I feel like it's such a shame, like, if you're going to be the guys who actually offer subtitles, because some YouTubers like Xiaobai, they don't, right? But if you are gonna offer them, do it right. KSP Wonders joining the chat. Hello, man.
这次815的 Geekbench 6能效进步呢，一方面是815的大核有明显的 IPC 提升，另一方面
iPhone is a lot better with thermals this year. Yeah, it's a lot better in thermals. It's actually now better than a lot of the Android side or the other sides, I guess.
Geekbench 6的测试方式呢，其实对英雄核心非常看重啊。天玑9500的 C1 Ultra， 其实在 Spec 2017的单核能效里，你可以看到啊，它和815的大核差距并没有这么夸张。
Really? Can it be seen a lot? Yeah, I guess here they have better efficiency on the A19 Gen 5 versus the D9500.
但是 GB6 的多核成绩啊，是超大核越多越强，那它的成绩就会越高。那恰好呢，815有2个满血超大核，反观天玑9500的1+3+4结构啊，导致那3颗能效不咋地的 C1 Premium 核心严重拖了整颗 CPU 的后腿，最终呢 GB6 成绩里啊就被815远远甩开了。不得不说
，Gamer Life, enjoy your basic iPhone 17. That's a great device this year. Really, really, truly great.
高通这个2+6结构才是现在的版本答案。那整体来说呢，我认为815的 CPU 能效表现算是稳步前行啊。多核能效呢甩开了天玑9500和 A19 Pro 接近，超大核能效在高频段提升比较明显，但是低频段确实没有带来任何提升，甚至还有小幅度倒车的情况。
Yeah, okay, so this is interesting, but I'm not sure if these graphs are not way too close to make any real statements, because again, this will be influenced by other parts. Maybe while it might be technically delivering like the same performance for more power, or actually lower power for the same amount of performance in these lower wattage ranges, there is a question like, what will actually the real world more benefit from? Like, for example, we saw the much better cache latency. Will that potentially come more into play than that like 0.05 difference in like watts?
那小核呢，虽说是架构改进不大，但是能效倒确实是有着
Yeah, so nothing still comes close to Apple's E-cores, yeah.
稳大的提升。只是815身上啊，有点让我们看到了英特尔前两年的影子。那目前这个频率大战打响之后呢，带来了超高的。
This is very, very measured, correctly aimed criticism. They are very much doing. I wouldn't even argue what Intel has been doing in the last 2 years, though Intel has now been. Like, the problem is, what do you mean the last 2 years? Like, do you mean like the Intel 285, so the 285K? That's the one on now 3 nanometer, or do you mean more like the 4900K and the 3900K, which were notably way higher clocked and therefore often unstable? That's why in some tests the 4900K actually still outperforms the 285K, but it just does like 5% more performance with like half a gigahertz more speed. But for that half a gigahertz, because of the older node, because of the older architecture, it then consumes like 50, 70, 100% more power than the 285K. That being said, the 285K is still not by any means the most efficient core design ever made. So even by N3B standards, right?
手机上难以置信的峰值功耗，明明日常能效才更重要，却还要在这个平时根本用不到的这个功耗段去大做文章，这样去卷一个没有人用得上的跑分数字，你说真的有必要吗？
Yeah. Because that's what they wanted to do. And a lot of websites mindlessly repeated like their numbers about 12,000 points in Geekbench. And I saw Tom's guide talk about how that will actually benefit it. I can actually find it for you guys. I posted like a screenshot of that in the Discord, but I actually want to find the actual article. So Tom's guide, 8 Elite Gen 5. I benchmark. I think that should be it, right? What's going on? Okay. Okay, so you see those high numbers that they have here. Here in actuality, they obviously have an even smaller gap between the single core results. Again, this is 10% higher clock specifically for this. But you see that the GPU difference is actually smaller this year than it was last year. You can even see in something like Steel Nomad Lite Unlimited, their iPhone 17 Pro Max outperformed the Qualcomm reference device. So maybe that one was a little bit heat soaked. And then you have some tests that range between 15% more powerful, 20% more powerful. These are smaller gaps than what we saw last year. And then we are going to get to Solar Bay. More specifically, we're going to go from Solar Bay to Solar Bay Extreme. But then we also have tests, for example, like video transcoding in Adobe Premiere Rush. And we see that the A19 Pro is over twice as fast as the 8 Elite Gen 5. We unfortunately don't have A18 numbers here. We see like a small 10% improvement from the 8 Elite to the Gen 5. And then we see the absolute clown show of the tech industry, which are the Tensor chips. This is why I tell people switching to 2 nanometer and switching to a new core design like the X925 or even now the C1 Ultra. It will not solve all the other auxiliary issues that Google just unfortunately enacts upon their Pixel chips. That being said here, look at this statement. But it's the iPhone 17 Pro Max comparison that will draw the most attention, and that's why you're drawing the attention to it. While Apple's phones still post to better single-core results, if only by a little. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 5's 12,208 figure on the multi-core test was 22% better than the result we just recorded for the iPhone 17 Pro Max A19 Pro Silicon. That would seem to suggest, and only an absolute brain dead fucking moron would say that, because you obviously should know that these numbers are, even Apple's like 10 to 11,000 number is not really reached in regular power consumption stats, but okay. But look at what they think this suggests. That would seem to suggest that Android phones that run to this on the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 will likely enjoy an edge when it comes to multitasking and running processor-intensive tasks. Proceed to an actual test. Granted, this one uses an accelerator, I'm not denying it, but a lot of stuff uses accelerators, AI accelerators, media encoders and decoders. And even then, even if the CPU was actually that much more powerful, will your CPU actually run at I don't even know what the power consumption supposedly is for those 12,000 points in Geekbench. Because again, Geekbench doesn't run long enough to actually fully test out power consumption. It's not spec in that regard. It's not Cinebench in that regard. Gamer, I do know the price of the iPhone 17. Who do you think I am?
那么聊完了稳步前行的 CPU， 那815的 GPU 呢？它会有天玑9500那样的惊喜吗？那么在 3D Mark SNL 当中， 这颗815跑出了3143分的峰值成绩。
So I wish they included the A18 Pro here because that would show that the gap between the 8 Elite was much larger with the A18 than now the 8 Elite Gen 5 has with the A19 Pro, which again, I always say the 3D Mark test, they definitely like their bandwidth, at least in like raster tests.
A19 Pro 和天玑9500之间，今年的3家 GPU 峰值成绩还是相对接近的啊。那如果我们结合功耗来看能效曲线的话，815的 GPU
This constant suggestion by them that the A19 is less efficient. Again, package power or just measuring problems? Are they measuring momentary spikes versus actually sustained peaks? Even more importantly, here you can see how it starts out to outperform in efficiency. So again, I'm not even sure how they drew this graph. Do they have the ability to manually control the clock speed of the A19 Pro? Like the GPU, because they clearly aren't able to do that with the CPU. So there are some questions here.
A1 能效也是稳稳的落在了 A19 Pro 和天玑9500之间。值得注意的是，在5到8瓦左右的功耗区间内，其实815的 GPU 性能并不会比天玑9500落后多少啊。那这个很可能就是这次增大 GPU 缓存所带来的收益。那么在核心规模上呢，高通并没有选择疯狂去堆料。那么因此呢，在10瓦以上啊，这个非常高的功耗区间，这时候815的峰值性能呢，就完全不是天玑9500的对手了。但是从能效表现来看，我认为它在实际游戏当中的表现，并不会有他们在峰值性能当中的差异来的那么大。反正
Correct.
这颗 Adreno 8407
This is why I always find it funny why they sometimes do have real-world tests, right? But then they still make statements based on artificial tests at the end of a video.
就是对去年8亿上那颗830做的查漏补缺，没有做特别大的迭代创新啊，只是说给足缓存，进一步去优化效率。那虽然这个光栅化的 SNL 表现不错，但是在光追侧向 Solar Bay Extreme 里，这颗 GPU 就没那么给力了。它的成绩比起
I also don't quite get it, right? You clearly can test the power consumption here, right? So that's still no mid light. Now I understand your time is valuable and your time is limited, but I would die to know the power consumption difference between these results, right? And also, that's why I always find Solar Bay, that base level test, completely worthless. Like, don't get me wrong, yes, mobile games are much more likely to get the kind of like low quality ray tracing that we get on basic Solar Bay rather than Solar Bay Extreme. The problem is that it does not allow us then to make really any statements, because most games in that case would pretty much forego ray tracing and just still use like screen space reflection, screen space more simple global illumination rather than ray tracing, right? And if we are just going by raster, now the question is still no mid light actually scaling in line with actual games? This is why I'm saying I am happy to say that Geekbench 6 GPU testing, even though it is an actual test of GPU compute power, is not representative of real-world games. Why is it not okay to make the same statement of 3D Mark's tests if they notoriously show Apple underperforming, something that then doesn't happen in actual games, especially at similar wattage? Why is it okay to make, for example, statements that the A19 Pro is less efficient when that's not the case in real games, right? And I know somebody might say, well, games will benefit from the higher efficiency of the CPU. But wouldn't that like kind of even itself out, especially in like more demanding games? This is why I would love to see some games that are clearly more GPU limited that are being tested rather than this very mixed workload, like maybe some games that only run at 30 FPS. That's why, unfortunately, you really feel the fact that Android does not have ports of games like Death Stranding or the Resident Evil series or Hitman. But we do have some demanding games that I believe are across iPhone and Android. Like, does not like... oh my god, what are these games called? Elite Sniper? Sniper Elite? I'm so confused because of the 8 Elite chips. Sniper Elite Mobile? Is it actually mobile or is it just on iOS? Change to English. Sniper Elite 4 is the version of the game available on mobile, launched in January 25 for newer Apple devices, including iPhone 15 Pro, Sniper Elite 3D. So Sniper Elite 4 is in fact iOS exclusive, and I believe that's because they made a Mac port, and I believe they've actually confirmed Sniper Elite 5 as well, right? Sniper Elite 5 latest version for Android. Yeah, that's always wrong. It's confirmed for iOS early next year. Okay, so that game is not an iOS user. That's not an iOS. What was the game? There was like one demanding like racing game that I believe is on high-end racing game mobile. Is it Grid Autosport? I know Horizon Chase is on like Hotly Pliga, that's racing. Yeah, Grid Autosport. I think that's it. Yeah, and it's on Android and on iOS. Like, test out some games like these, right? Oh, it's not Horizon Chase. That's in sorry, that's in Apple Arcade. It's a different game. Yeah, you have so much stuff that like at least still is visually interesting, yet all the games these guys ever test are the same like Wuthering Waves and what Genshin Impact, right? Like there's so many games, and of course, when you're comparing only A series chips at that point, well, not only, right? But if you're like your primary review is, for example, about the A19 Pro, I would love you to test out some stuff. Specifically about like how do the Resident Evil games run, maybe do even some files tweaking on the Mac, so you can tweak graphical settings more deeply than the game otherwise allows on iOS. Do something. Stop doing the same thing, because I will keep commenting on the same problems.
实际游戏当中的表现并不会有他们在峰值性能当中的差异来的那么大。反正这颗 Adreno 840 GPU 呢，就是对去年8亿上那颗830做的查漏补缺，没有做特别大的迭代创架构。当然我们也
Okay, so we saw the big difference in ray tracing results. Riley saying they need to get Rockstar to port GTA 6 to Mac. They also need Rockstar to port GTA 5 to iPhone, iPad, and Mac. GTA 5 was a game that was running on the PlayStation 3, a game that had to split 512 megabytes of RAM, so it effectively only had 256 megabytes of memory. It can run on A17 Pro chips and up. Especially they've recently modernized it with a slightly more modern version of the game engine, and I believe with DX12 support on PC. They introduced features like ray tracing, so they could really use older game settings for things like Apple's for iOS and even iPads to a degree, and then on like M Pro and M Max chips, there you really benefit from like some of the newer PC stuff like ray tracing and obviously higher frame rates. GTA Online, we are still like 9 months away or so from GTA 6. How long do you think, and that's only on consoles, how long do you think it will take for GTA Online to come to PC? So just like the new version of GTA Online. Just launch GTA Online and GTA 5 as it currently is across iOS, iPads, and Macs. I'm sure if you went to Apple would be happy to pay for the port. Whether it's for you internally to work on the code so you can actually familiarize with it and then start maybe making a Mac GTA 6 port, or even better, Apple just pays an intermediary what was it? What are they called? What are the developers who ported like Tomb Raider to Mac? Feral Interactive, right? Feral Interactive. Yeah, so they are a dedicated port studio, and they have done some pretty good Mac ports. So do that, Apple.
1000分左右啊。 毕竟这代815并没有像隔壁两家那样。
And again, also it's funny. Like, do they mention the percentage difference here? And I would love to know the power consumption difference, because imagine if this actually does consume like 12 watts here. And then these are also 12 watts, right? What's the ray tracing efficiency here?
当然，我们也测试了它的吞吐量。FP32性能仅仅是从前代的2.9 TFLOPS 提升到了3.2 TFLOPS， 那基本上这就是平时的提升。而今年大家都支持的双倍 FP16 算力也没能出现在高通这颗 GPU 上，它的 FP16 半精度算力和 FP32。
I hate the fact that they don't include the other numbers here, because that would make my job significantly easier.
单精度算力完全相同，那它也没有类似 Tensor Core 这样的单元，取而代之的呢是支持了 GPU 和 NPU 直通了，不用经过内存。
I mean, it does have an NPU. Technically, Tensor Cores, well, Tensor Cores, the way they're done on NVIDIA, they're similar. They're kind of a mix between an Apple neural engine and the Apple neural accelerators for the GPU, because they can function independently a little bit, but not quite as independently as Apple's neural engine, because efficiency is not their biggest focus. It's raw performance, and that's why it's deeper integrated with the GPU. But this one does have Tensor cores. They're just on the neural engine. It just doesn't have dedicated accelerators for the GPU. So it's not a one-to-one, especially since I hate the word tensor at this point, because tensor is like the name of the AI accelerators on NVIDIA's GPUs. It's obviously the name of NVIDIA's, Google's chips. So yeah, I would love just a different name. So GPU neural accelerator versus an actual neural engine or NPU or TPU, whatever.
现阶段啊，高通还是想让 NPU 来做 Tensor Core 的工作。但是在总体上来讲呢，在新特性支持上啊，高通这个 GPU 今年依然是比较吊打。那理论上做完呢，我们
my own A17 Pro, 17 Pro Max
可以给815做一个总结了。那不管是 CPU 还是 GPU， 在我看来呢，这一代都是慢慢往前走，它只是发挥出了前代大改后新价格的潜力，而并不是革命性的一代。你可以说815相比较于8E能效会好看一点，但是呢，也并没有什么令人惊喜的新特性。而至于游戏性能，还有这一代新平台的续航表现，那大家就可以去看一下我们对各个机型的评测视频了。
They don't have the most detailed numbers because they don't have a lot of regular devices on hand. But speaking of regular devices that they have on hand, let's talk about the OnePlus 15, because they get like crazy early access apparently. Now some others as well. So they do present some numbers here. So apparently they're non-reference testing. It did came from the OnePlus 15. I do believe that they confirmed that here that the OnePlus 15 basically runs at LPDDR5X 9600. These numbers are what we just saw in the previous video, including Steel Nomad Lite. So what's more interesting here is, of course, the real gaming performance. And here you can actually see in a very good result, I would argue, that the power consumption has come down from generation to generation. We can argue about like frame time stability. iOS seems to be a little bit jumpy. Again, it is a big problem that they're testing games with basically exactly the same art style, with often the same engines. I believe Genshin Impact is Genshin Impact game engine. What does it use? It's using Unity, and I believe Wuthering Waves is actually using Unreal Engine. That's why it's so much more demanding. Yeah, it's Unreal Engine 4. But for example, like the reason why I'm talking about games all using similar technology, and of course it's not the problem if you test different Unity games or different Unreal Engine games, but then you test them from like the same developer with the same art style. Like for example, Genshin Impact uses Unity, and it's made by MiHoYo, right? Honkai Star Rail is using Unity and is made by MiHoYo. Zenless Zone Zero is using Unity and is made by MiHoYo, right? So testing often some of these same games is really, really highly problematic. The one outlier here is Wuthering Waves as an Unreal Engine game. And then again, Unreal Engine unfortunately often has like its own issues these days, whether it's shader compilation issues or too aggressive ray tracing. Now, I don't think that's the case specifically with Wuthering Waves, but just trying to make you understand, this is why it would be great to have those AAA ports on something like Android, so we can actually see those comparisons side by side.
6帧，整机功耗5.9瓦。 和天玑9005机型比起来，功耗也要稍微低一些。44.7度的最高机身温度虽然不像 iPhone 那么低啊，但仍然是可以接受的。不过总体来说呢
，Wuthering runs at 120 FPS on iPhone, right? Is that exclusive? And yeah, Honkai Star Rail
大旗舰
comes
的
next.
整体的表现是挺接近的。那相比较于上代8亿的机型，功耗都有明显的降低。当我们把分辨率拉到非常高 991P 之后，那
991p is apparently super high resolution. So this is actually another factor here, which is and this is unfortunately not considered.
是挺接近的。
I'm not sure because they do mention the resolution, right? And you can see that they are very close. 770, 763, 745. iPhone basically a tiny bit lower resolution here, right? But then you have to consider things like, does Wuthering Waves use metal effects? Yes, Wuthering Waves uses metal effects on iOS devices. And people report it as, this is now Google's Gemini AI engine, that it has a positive impact on graphics. Do you see why you need to really break down all settings in detail? Because there is a chance that the iPhone runs technically at a low resolution here, right? But it actually has a much more demanding workload because it's also simultaneously potentially upscaling this resolution. So just trying to make sure that obviously here the 1% low of 30 FPS is kind of garbage. So I'm really not sure like why they don't have 1% lows on iPhones, because if you look at channels like DameTech, it's possible to measure that. But these are now details to their methodology that I unfortunately I'm incapable of analyzing. Yeah, this is now running at higher, no, is that at high resolution? No, still not. So you can see the iPhone 17 Pro Max comes closer maybe to the 8 Elite of last gen. But then again, we now have no power metrics. And when we look at the heat, oh my God, why make it so small? Jesus Christ, I legit cannot see that. And I legit cannot zoom in. Oh, okay. Okay, so wait, wow, the iPhone is actually the coldest here by far. Nice. And actually the iPhone even leaves some room on the edges specifically so you can hold it. So it's actually quite well engineered in that regard. But again, I don't know why some data is missing. Not claiming it's a conspiracy theory to make Android look better or anything like that. And yeah, Riley, I know you're presenting this as a joke, like it's the femboy setup of games. But there are legit other games, right? Like Grid Sport, for example. You could at least run that. I know you are primarily like appealing to the Chinese market here, but my God, there are other games to test.
钢铁魔鬼测试，那么这
Oh yeah, I need subtitles. I forgot that.
时候1+15呢依然坚持住了平均59.4帧，9500G 864P 分辨率下，1+15可以稳定跑在59.8帧，功耗。
Again, this is why. Like, what do you mean it runs at stable 59.8? I understand that's the average, but like 1% low is literally half that. What does that, like, will you comment on that? What's that the result of? Is that the result of cutscenes that are locked to 30 FPS? But then that would make much sense here. And I mean, these are giant differences in performance of like 20%. From 29.3 to 35.9 FPS. So the fact that it's using more power, sure, that might look like a lot because I mean it's consuming 30% more power. But these are really details we must know. What are the actual settings? What are potentially frame locks in the game? So this is where it's either maybe they do outline it in small text here, but that to me does not seem like they're listing every single game setting.
5.1瓦，那这个能效相比较于前代的8亿机型呢，进步是非常明显的，功耗也远低于天玑9500机型。
This should also be though really good for battery life, right? So devices that have like 7,000 milliampere hours this year, they might have been previously devices that have more like 6,500 milliampere hours last year. So the fact that you're reducing power consumption by potentially 20% while giving you the same pretty much performance, this is also a little bit of like a question. Sorry, I muted myself for a second. They do mention the lower power consumption, but then they don't mention that they actually have 10% lower, 1% low. So very clearly something is still not 100% aligned.
那机身最高温度只有42度出头，表现确实不错啊。那应该说，明朝是很典型的高通优势的游戏，这代815毫无疑问的再获佳绩。
Okay, see, they even mentioned that it's a game that benefits Qualcomm, right? But where are your games that benefit Dimensity? Where are your games that benefits Apple A chips?
那最后呢，我们也跑了王者120帧的极致画质啊。那1+15的1%low帧呢倒是表现不错，游戏全程没有任何掉帧。不过3.5瓦功耗并不会比前代的8亿机型更低。
The only truly impressive thing that I've seen thus far from an 8 Elite device here, for one, I do like the reduced power consumption, but it's this here. It's Delta Force. And that one is running it up to 165 FPS on the OnePlus. So they actually work together with the developer. The 1% lows are extremely close. So this will be noticeably smoother than any 60 FPS game. Now, I personally have trouble seeing beyond 90 FPS. But this will definitely feel super smooth. And the fact that it's running this at under 5 watts, that to me is by far the most impressive result. I do not understand why there aren't comparisons here at like even 120 FPS. You could like make an efficiency graph or something like that, but yeah, I guess they just really had to deliver these numbers very quickly, and I am looking forward to seeing more numbers down the line. I will be looking at numbers from other YouTubers like Dametech, but yeah, for now I'll have to say that I kind of agree with the titles that they gave it across the board. Decent, even good gaming performance on the OnePlus 15, at least in the games that are being tested here. Pretty predictable generational results in CPU and GPU, especially once you include SME on the CPU side. Some questionable choices when it comes to peak power consumption to achieve the highest results, but something that a well-managed device could overcome. I mean, in theory, nobody forces you to run the 8 Elite Gen 5 at 4.6 gigahertz, especially not in regular usage. Yeah, but then obviously then you would have to kind of also be honest and make it run slower in a benchmark, but that's a different story. Now, before we finish up, there are some smaller Apple stories that I just would like for you to take note of. Apple has commented on the scratch gate that people have observed. Basically, they're obviously tested by the likes of Jailbreak Everything, but one thing that people have also started to notice is that iPhone 17s, specifically iPhone 17 Pros, got scratched by the MagSafe stands inside Apple stores. And basically Apple is saying that that's to blame on the MagSafe stand. I assume that when people move it up and down the stand, they probably scuffed up that plateau. And that's just a reminder for you to be a little bit more careful, specifically if you're using something like Apple's MagSafe charging puck yourself. But this to me is absolutely a non-issue. Like, I do prefer the aluminum feel. I do prefer the benefits of better heat dissipation. And obviously it does not crack like glass. So that's absolutely Great. Riley saying Resident Evil are on sale again. They're also on sale on PlayStation. I saw that today. So they're probably just doing general like autumn fall sales. Hope they get the update for newer hardware. Well, you can tune the settings right yourself if you go like through a Mac and configure the files. But yeah, they should really expose much more game settings on iOS and iPadOS, just like they do on Mac, because on Mac it's just as customizable and configurable as it is on PC. Then Apple has commented on the EU laws, including things like the Digital Markets app and how it impacts their implementation of newer features. They did, for example, brought up iPhone mirroring and AirPods live translation as two examples of features that are delayed, in fact, indefinitely in their release to the European Union. And they've also commented on things like privacy concerns from third-party app stores. They've commented on the availability of corn apps on third-party app stores. And basically, they're making the argument that the DMA is kind of shit. I do agree. I think that the regulations from the DMA are absolutely silly. I think what Europe should have done is increase the tax burden on foreign companies. I think they should have mandated certain like regulations on social media and things like that. But mandating third-party stores, uprooting the entire security and privacy model of these platforms, that to me makes no sense. Then, just as a small side note, I know a lot of people, I know that the Apple doomed like memes are exactly that. They are memes. But Apple clearly does not believe they are doomed. They recently significantly upped, for example, the order of iPhone 17 models, but also they are opening actually a ton of new Apple stores right now. I believe one is actually opening up tomorrow. So they're expanding across Asia, the Middle East. So if you are somebody who might have thought that Apple might be doomed, then yeah. Don't be, please stop thinking that. Hazim, I have no idea who you are, but thank you for being here, even if what you're typing in the chat is a little bit nonsensical. There's also a public beta of iOS 26.1, iPadOS 26.1, macOS Tahoe 26.1. I do not recommend you install that first beta. It's actually a little bit less stable in my findings than the regular release of iOS 26. And it basically makes no impact on the Mac. Though you saw like how one pop-up in Safari had issues, so I'm not sure if that had anything to do potentially with Tahoe 26.1. So the developer beta was out early in the week, and now we also yesterday got the first public betas. So if you feel like testing it, or you are a developer and you need to test it, now you can. And last, and this is a little bit more for my own mental health, as I mentioned early on, it's HyperOS 3. It's basically Xiaomi's new operating system, or Android skin that's on top of Android 16. Kudos to them to at least rolling it out to like the last 3-4 generations of Android of the devices, I believe down to the Xiaomi 12 series. But the thing I want to comment on is just how outrageous their copying of Apple has gotten, right? You will especially find that things like their AI stuff looks one-to-one, like how Apple Intelligence looks on iOS. They didn't even bother with a completely different name. Apple's Dynamic Island, they basically rebranded into Hyper Island. You can see that they even copy, and I think that's like, obviously this has existed before, this is now expanded. For one, I think they're going too far in how many features they're pushing into it. Like at that point, just make like Android has actual multitasking, or make some pop-up widgets. Like, why do I need to scroll through all the settings here? But I guess that's because, Apple kind of does it. So even though Apple does it with at maximum 2 widgets, but okay. Yeah, it looks one-to-one, basically, like the dynamic island. It's called an island. It's because it's part of HyperOS. It's called the Hyper Island, and it even copies this oval plus circle design, which again is extremely dynamic island. It's actually like super specific because it forms the letter I, right? And I'm like, why does Xiaomi feel the need to play around with that visual? You can also see that the logos for cellular and Wi-Fi and even the fonts look closer than ever to Apple. Hasim asking, do they have action button for AI as well? They do have an action button, I believe. I'm not sure if Xiaomi is the brand who copied it or Vivo, but yeah, plenty of them have at this point. Even I believe OnePlus, right? I believe OnePlus used to have like actually that 3-step mute switch, right? So mute, on, and vibration in the middle. So it actually had a little bit more functionality than Apple's mute switch, but then they fully copied the action button. And I'm not sure, was it HyperOS that copied the action button's user interface? Or was it like ColorOS? Change to English, please. Is it not HyperOS? Is it ColorOS? Was it Vivo? Because I saw them. Oh yeah, is that it? No, that's Apple's actual action button. Oxygen OS. Oxygen OS. No, did Oxygen OS copy it? Because Oxygen OS is the OnePlus thing. But like somebody just copied the action button one-to-one, like with the interface. I'm almost inclined to say it was Xiaomi, but I'm not sure. But somebody did. Oh, Oppo. It might have been Oppo. Jesus. You know also, by the way, that it's bad when it comes to Chinese devices, when you really cannot tell which one is copying what. So Oppo copies Apple's action button, and I believe they even copied the settings page for it to the most part. Is that it? Yeah. Wait. I'm not even sure. Is that just iOS or is that how much they copied it? Yeah, like, yeah, this has gotten insane. Like, I don't know how this is allowed because honestly, okay, so this looks a little bit different actually. But I have seen one where it just looks almost one-to-one. But yeah, the copying has gone super much too far. You can also see that the iconography settings. Obviously, I don't need to remind about the clock, calculator, the weather app, obviously being a big example here. Why don't I not have weather over here? You know, though, how the weather. Photos being notable, photos, notes. The file manager looks basically exactly like Files does on iOS. Weather widgets, calendar widgets, all very much inspired. The Photos app has this like basically a 2-tab layout. It also has like all these separate ones. This is exactly the layout of the iOS app. Where their AI, the camera app looks extremely AI. They have that glow. They're even using like different like things for similar things for stuff like writing tools. Even the way that the results pop up looks extremely similar to how Siri and ChatGPT results come up. This looks exactly like it does on iOS. It's not even funny. Like, come on. And that to me is like, I could never support them. You can see like their Spotlight search version has a similar layout here. At least they do differentiate it a little bit by separating these results, but man, it's really not enough. And I just wanted to show you that because part of the reason why I support Apple over these brands is not just that, oh, I have some blind loyalty to Apple. It's really that these companies have been pissing me off more and more over the years. And this is why I dislike a lot of what Samsung does these days with the Galaxy Watch Ultra and with the latest Galaxy Buds. I do at least respect their attempt to make One UI look decently different. But then I look at One UI 8.5 and then I already see some small morsels of copying from iOS. So maybe I'll cover that in a future video. But guys, we've now been streaming over 2 hours. I'm about to wrap this up, so please do the YouTube jazz before we end. Subscribe, like, share, comment. If you want to support me directly, leave a super chat or super sticker. Consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Consider becoming a Patreon supporter. Consider joining our Discord. That's actually the last thing that I'm gonna do here. Gonna leave that in the live chat. I know you can find that in the description of this channel, but I also know a lot of you are helped when it's right in the live chat. So always forget how it is. Here, invite members, edit invite links to never expire, copy the link. I'm just gonna paste it in the chat. Why did my video close? There it is. Wait, why can I not click on my video? There it is. No, I'm sorry, Hazim, but Apple copying 120 Hz is not even close to the same. First of all, 120 Hz did not originate on Android. We've had 120 Hz monitors and TVs long before that. Second, it's a hardware feature where more equals better. So it's not the same as an overall design language or the entire paradigm of the dynamic island. So also, what do you mean Apple is copying 120 Hz? Do I need to remind you in what year Apple introduced 120 Hz on a mobile product? It was on the 2017 iPad Pro. When was the official launch date? I believe it was actually A10X iPad Pro. I think it came out in WWDC, so I think it came out in June of 2017, predating most high refresh rate Android devices. Yeah, 5th of June 2017. So no, Apple is not copying 120 Hz. Apple is copying some stuff. I'm not denying that. That's part of the overall story. You can get inspired by your competitors, but you cannot copy one-to-one. That's the difference between like an actual competitor and a copycat. Right? And in the end, you will never gain the same loyalty if you are perceived as a copycat. So, Hazim, but that's what you're here for, right? You can learn. You can learn with us, because the idea is not that we praise Apple here for all reasons, right? We criticize them when it's deserved. Their storage pricing or their RAM pricing, or the fact that it took them this long to give promotion to a base iPhone. But we also, for example, differentiate between ProMotion and just 120 Hz screens. A lot of 120 Hz LTPS screens are not very efficient. They're not very long lasting. Samsung has a lot of issues with like green lines on their OLED screens. I'm not sure what the main culprit of it is, whether it's just general lower quality of LTPS versus LTPO, or the way they make their display controllers. I mean, it definitely happens on their LTPO panels too. But there should be a question asked about, like, is it actually good to just overclock a screen, to have a screen that has high refresh rate but not variable refresh rate? And that's what we cover here on this channel. We cover actual performance, we cover real world differences, and I do criticize Apple whenever it's deserved. We might have different opinions of when it's deserved or not, but we do criticize Apple here. We just don't do it mindlessly. We don't do it out of hate, and we don't do it out of the perceived pro-consumer perspective, like people like Louis Rossman, who like hate Apple because they don't make their devices as repairable as like the Fairphone or framework, right? That company that Linus Tech Tips has invested in. No, we criticize Apple based on we want good products and we want them for a fair amount of money, while understanding that Apple likes higher profit margins. We understand that Apple delivers a more curated experience, even in some ways deliberately limiting the experience, like not having alternative app stores, at least by default on iOS, not having multitasking on a small 6-inch screen, in comparison to then opening up the iPad to actually work more like macOS. And obviously it would now become a 2-hour tirade if I started explaining all the pros and cons of all of Apple's products and all of Apple's individual pricing choices. But that is what we do. Riley saying the rumors are so dry. I am surprised we haven't seen anything about the M5 iPad Pro, because so many people are basically still predicting that it's coming in October or something like that, at least later this year. I wonder, hey, I still have a $100 bet running, might be $150, I honestly forgot. Like maybe Apple is actually building M5 on 2 nanometer, and that's why it's taking up until January or March to release it, but I wouldn't bet money on that. That's just my own playful thoughts with you guys. Guys, now I really do have to wrap it up because I haven't eaten anything today yet. So I will have to get some calories into me for today. Thank you so much for commenting, for chatting, for just joining the stream, for leaving a like. It all helps tremendously. Again, you can support this channel directly with super chats, super stickers, by becoming a channel member, by becoming a supporter over on Patreon. I've left the link to our Discord if you feel like joining that. Plenty of opportunities to engage with me, with the growing community here. I appreciate each and every one of you, whether you agree or disagree. Just as long as we are polite and we are willing to learn from each other, I think that's all that matters. Thank you guys so much for today. As always, let me know what else you would like to see me react to next, and I'll catch you then. This is Big Mark, not to forget to please Riley, but now it's Big Mark tuning out.